In one of his early essays, Nietzsche distinguishes between three different approaches to history. There's what he calls Antiquarian history, so that's the digging up of treasures, the accumulation of lovely stuff from the past. So this is, for example, if you go to the Cairo Museum and you see the treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, right? You're not supposed to think about what they mean. You're not supposed to think about how the Egyptian pharaohs accumulated all that gold, nor are you really supposed to think about what they thought they were doing. I mean, a fascinating thing about the Egyptian pharaohs is that all of their tombs were robbed, apart from Tutankhamun's, right? So for generations, hundreds of years, the pharaohs knew that the tombs of their ancestors had been robbed, and they went to elaborate lengths to try and avoid having their own tombs robbed, but they never hit on the fairly obvious strategy of not being buried with loads of treasure. That means that being buried with loads of treasure is absolutely vital to kingship in ancient Egypt, right? So there's an interesting question there about, what did they think they were doing? What was the conception of kingship and burial and the religious role of the dead king that meant that they just could not take the obvious option of not being buried with a treasure trove? Now, antiquarian history doesn't want you to ask those kinds of questions. It just wants you to admire the lovely things, right? Look at the lovely gold, look at the lovely, the craftsmanship with which the chariot wheels and the thrones and so on have been made. So that's antiquarian history, treasures of the past. The second kind of history he talks about is monumental history. So this is similar in that it's uncritical, but it's about erecting monuments to our nation's greatness, right? So this is where you have a statue of Churchill outside Parliament. All of those statues of military men in Whitehall, all that stuff, right? Nelson on his column. And that's where the past is there to make you appreciate, the greatness of your nation, right? Make you feel the duty that you have to it to maintain its glory and join its army and support its institutions and so on and so forth. Again, this is uncritical history, but it's history with a definite purpose. And finally, there's critical history, and this is the kind of history that corrodes, that unpicks the first two, because the more you know about the great men of your nation's past and how they achieved their greatness and so on, the less impressive it is. Remember what we said in the first week about stork stories. Nietzsche's quite interesting about this because this introduces a thought that we will see more of later on, and that is that the truth may not be very good for you, that the truth may get in the way of healthy living. Now, this is an idea that's had a bit more play in recent years because it turns out that knowing yourself thoroughly is more associated with mild depression than with robustly cheerful good health. That in order to have the best kind of mental health, you may need to have a few illusions about yourself and about how popular you are and about how rosy your future is. But it's also a possibility, and one that Nietzsche explores, that in order to be healthy, to have robust good health as a nation, it may be important to have some common myths. It may be important to believe that your country's past is glorious and that its civilization is superior and so on and so forth. Otherwise, what are you fighting for when you join its army, right? And so the people who want history to be taught in that kind of way, maybe they know something. Maybe on some deep level that they can't admit, they understand that if all the history that's taught in schools is critical history, then maybe people won't be quite such patriotic citizens, and the worry is always that if you as a country become too self-critical, too self-aware, have too deep an understanding of your past, so that you feel less inclined to join in the army and fight for the monuments and so on, you will be swept aside by some nation which has no such scruples, you will be swept aside by some nation which firmly believes in its own myths and its own heroic past. And you can see some of this in the recent controversies about statues. And it reminds me of how we think about graves, because the whole ceremonial about graves is built on the fiction that when you lay someone to rest in the grave, you're putting them there forever, and that the stone that you lay over the top will always be there. But everybody knows that graveyards are managed, that if the family doesn't keep up the payments, the grave will be closed, that the body will be moved, and the plot will be made available to somebody else. And if you go to a historic church, you'll find that the church may have been flagged with old gravestones. And if you read the history of the graveyard, at some point there will have been reburials and people dug up and moved. And of course the giant graveyards in major cities, it's absolutely standard to have a clear out, especially if the land gets used for something else. There are cases where somebody decides to build a station on what was a historic graveyard, so the graves all get dug up and the bones all get catalogued and then reburied somewhere else. This is absolutely standard, right? No grave is forever. No gravestone stands in all eternity. And it's the same for statues. Statues are being erected and taken down all the time. And yet, the argument about a statue, whether it should go up, whether it should come down, whether it should be changed, is all conducted on the assumption that once a statue goes up, it's up permanently. And perhaps we should think about statues as a kind of process. Even though statues don't move unless we move them, the fact is we're moving them all the time. They're always under review. And that's a kind of model of how we need to think of all our institutions. And you can get into a more sort of Nietzschean spirit just by going around and looking for discourses, controversies, arguments where there's an assumption that we're arguing forever, that we're having to decide now what a statue or a gravestone or a law or a flag or a border is going to be for all eternity. When the lesson of human history is that everything changes and everything passes.
Everything passes, everything changes.
And so the three questions that genealogy presents to us are: what are we? How did we become whatever we now are? And what can we become in the future? And it's that last question that Nietzsche is keen to ask, that you won't find in Hegel or any of the other historically minded German philosophers, that they tend to be historically minded in the sense that they obey the historian's dictum, that historians should never make predictions. It's not the historian's place to say what's going to happen in the future. And that's a standard bit of historical rigour And Hegel, for example, sticks with that. But Nietzsche is endlessly thinking about the future. And he wants us to think of present-day humanity as a kind of intermediate point between our baboon-like far ancestors, the happy warriors, the sort of cheerful but dim Homeric heroes, the vengeful priests, the gay troubadours of Provence, and some kind of higher, better human who will come to be at some point in the future. That's why the tone is often so kind of highly wrought, because it's about what we're going to become. It's all to play for.